Listen up, if tomorrow you wanted to fork over your life savings in order to climb Mount Everest, well, you would be walking right into a graveyard of over 200 bodies that are still on the mountain. Some bodies are buried, some are hidden, waiting to be discovered, and there are even an alarming number of bodies that are so visible they act as literal landmarks to Everest climbers to this day. Today, I'm going to tell you the stories of 5 Everest climbers who never left the mountain, dead or alive. And for this kind of video, it only makes sense that we put these stories in some sort of order. I'll be ranking these stories based on how many times the climber's body has been seen by other climbers. And so you'll need to stick around to the end because what happened in our last story is so shocking that it changed the way that I view Mount Everest forever. On May 15th, 1982, Marty Hoey and a group of teammates packed up their gear and climbed out of Camp 5 at around 25,000 feet. They were strapped into their harnesses and ropes, and they were pulling themselves slowly up the mountain at about a 45-degree angle. When they reached 26,600 feet, Marty and one of her teammates, Jim Wickwire, stopped to rest for just a brief moment. While this was happening, another teammate asked Jim to pass up some rope, and in order for this to be accomplished, a very simple move had to happen. Marty needed to lean slightly back on her harness to let Jim pass by her, and as she began to do this, she had no idea that she only had a few seconds left to live. Marty was young, fearless, and well before her Everest attempt, she had made a name for herself. Born in 1951, Marty grew up with a love for the mountains, working at ski resorts and national parks in her time off between school. And speaking of school, everyone that knew her back then knew that school was not going to be where Marty peaked. No pun intended. Marty started working as a professional guide on Mount Rainier, which she summited over 100 times. At only 23 years old, she would end up summiting Lenin Peak in Tajikistan, which is only about 5,000 feet lower than Everest's peak. And then 3 years later, she summited Nandi Devi, which is only 3,000 feet lower than Everest Peak. She also led several expeditions to Denali in Alaska, which is a brutal climb, as well as many technical hikes across the Rocky Mountains. Marty was obviously an elite climber, so it came as no surprise to anyone that she soon decided to take on Mount Everest and to try to make history in the progress by setting not one, but 2 different records. And speaking of making history, I'm also trying to make history by becoming the first graduate of Rice Memorial High School in Burlington, Vermont to ever reach 1 million subscribers on YouTube. So please join me in this history-making quest by hitting the subscribe button right now. I already missed my 10-year high school reunion, but when the 15-year rolls around, I want something to brag about. Anyways, when Marty turned 30, she announced that she would be not only climbing Mount Everest, but that she was attempting to become the first American woman to ever do so, and that she would be doing it on a never-before-traveled route up the north side of the mountain. And in April of 1982, Marty, who is now 31 years old, began her ascent of Everest alongside an all-male team. Due to a sloppy monsoon season, the mountain had become more like exposed rock and hard ice than usual, if that makes sense, but Marty's team was ready to overcome anything. The 16 men that she went up with wanted her to set that record just as much as she did. After about 3 weeks of climbing, making camp, resting, and then climbing some more, the group made Camp 5 at around 25,000 feet. But now they faced a new challenge: a steep climb up rock and ice in order to reach a safe area to establish Camp 6, which sounds very daunting, but this would be basically the last step before making their final summit push, and so there was added excitement to this particular day. But Marty would never make it to Camp 6, nor the summit for that matter. She would never go on to become the first American woman to reach the highest point on Earth. After pushing up the mountain for a while, Marty and Jim took that break I told you about earlier, and when Jim needed to pass by her, she leaned back slightly on her harness. And when she did this, she heard a sound that no climber ever wants to hear. A metal click, meaning that her harness was unbuckled from the fixed rope. In a moment of sheer horror, I don't know how else to describe it, Marty's teammates watched as a buckle on her harness opened up, and then she plunged 6,000 feet down into a deep crevasse. This is the kind of stuff that makes me never want to climb Mount Everest, because just like that, she was gone. All that she left behind was her ice axe, which remained stuck into the side of the mountain. The men around her were just stunned, in total disbelief at what they just saw, and eventually they mustered up the strength to retreat back down to Camp 5. The very next day, a few of them went on a search mission for Marty, but this was more symbolic than anything else. I mean, she was gone, they knew this. Almost mercifully, a giant storm rolled over Mount Everest the very next day, and this gave the group their final excuse to call it quits. One of the climbers from the group claimed that Marty Hoey was the world's best high-altitude female climber, and on her last day, her one mistake was that her buckle was slightly loose, likely due to her fingers being numb and her not being able to actually feel if it was locked in. If it wasn't for that simple mistake, she would have most likely summited Mount Everest, made history, and of course, survived. The grim reality is that Marty's body most likely won't ever be discovered. Some Sherpas considered a recovery effort, but without any sort of clues as to exactly where her body could have, just disappeared to after the fall, it just wasn't worth the risk to the Sherpas. Now, it is possible that an Everest climber on the north side might one day come across her remains, but this seems incredibly unlikely from my research. However, this next story is about another person whose disappearance made it seem like finding their body would basically be impossible until it wasn't. How the hell does that happen? What happens next is shocking, but before I tell you about it, one of the ways that I get through telling these horror stories every single week is by trying to make you guys laugh a little bit during my ad reads. And so I'm going to attempt and probably fail at doing that now. But hey, let me know if I ended up giving you a chuckle or if I didn't. Or actually, if you don't laugh, maybe just keep that to yourself. Anyways, this video is sponsored by Mint Mobile. And speaking of horror stories, they looked at my old phone bill and said, yeah, that's a horror story. As someone who basically lives at trailheads and Walmart parking lots, I need my phone to work without my carrier charging me like I'm roaming on Mars. Mint Mobile gives me premium wireless on the nation's largest 5G network with unlimited talk and text, plus hotspot data on their unlimited plan, so I can upload videos, check maps, and of course Google symptoms of mild hypothermia from the back of my SUV. Everything happens online at mintmobile.com. There's no stores, no salespeople, no let me talk to my manager stupid side quests. You can bring your own unlocked phone, you can keep your numbers, and you can keep all of your contacts, so your mom doesn't suddenly become unknown caller yelling at you about your life choices. You can even activate in minutes with eSIM. Mint also does this bulk buy thing with wireless, 3, 6, or 12-month plans, and the more months that you buy up front, the more money you actually save. And they even let you pick how much data you need, 5 gigabytes, 15 or 20 gigabytes, or unlimited. And so you're not paying for some one-size-fits-nobody type of plan. And all plans include free calling to Mexico, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and they've got a 7-day money-back guarantee if you somehow decide that you enjoy overpaying your old carrier. And for a limited time this holiday season, you can get 50% off an unlimited premium wireless plan from Mint. And let me say that again. 50% off. That is probably the best deal a sponsor has ever given my audience, frankly. And so click the link in the description or scan the QR code to lock in Mint's lowest price of the year and pay $15 a month for a 3, 6, or 12-month plan. All right. That probably wasn't my funniest ad ever, but hopefully I gave you a little chuckle, and now let's get back into this horror story. Okay, we're gonna have to travel back in time right now, 139 years to be exact, to meet a man who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, named George Mallory. Now, I have told a decent amount of George's story in previous videos, but he is so significant to Mount Everest history that there's no way I can make this video without finally telling his full story. George was born in a quiet British village, but quiet maybe isn't really an accurate description of George himself, because from a young age, he was a standout in school, social life, and sports. At 16 years old, he went on a hiking trip to the Alps where he fell in love with high-altitude mountaineering. But, given his age and his point in life around this trip, there was a question that haunted him and haunts everyone at this stage of life, and that, of course, is what was George going to do for a career? After all, it's not like he could just make YouTube videos for a living, though if he did, he'd probably tell you guys to smash the subscribe button right now. Was that too far? After graduating from university, George chose a much more admirable career than YouTube. He chose teaching. And by all accounts, George was a superstar teacher, but like, I don't know how to say this, the kind of teacher who the other teachers didn't really like that much. He was a bit of a know-it-all, but he was happy because once again, he was this standout person. He always had been. But in 1914, history reminded him and millions of other young men just like him how quickly you can go from being a standout to just another body. I'm talking, of course, about World War I, where Mallory enlisted in the British Army. For almost 5 years, he fought across France and England. And so in basically the blink of an eye, George had gone from being an energetic 22-year-old to a 32-year-old war veteran and a father. He returned to being a teacher after the war, but, after everything he had experienced, this career just wasn't thrilling for him anymore. He wanted to stand out once again like he had before the war. And he realized that the place where he stood out the most wasn't in the classroom or on the battlefield for that matter, but at the peak of a mountain. And so George started reaching out to his old climbing buddies, expressing interest in getting back involved. And in 1921, one of these friends sent George a fateful invitation with a letterhead from a brand new organization. The name of this group made George's eyes widen with both excitement and also with fear because it was the Mount Everest Committee. George was recruited for the first official recon expedition of Mount Everest, which had never been summited before at this point. He would need to be away from his family for many months and resign from his teaching job, but George and his wife agreed that he couldn't say no to this opportunity. In 1921, George and his team established the Tibetan route that would take them up the northern ridge, but they weren't able to summit that year due to some weather issues. And then in 1922, they tried summiting 3 more times, but they failed each and every time. And so after this, they'd have to wait until 1924 to try again. And with his advancing age, George knew that this expedition would be his final shot. George's 1924 expedition included several other hotshot climbers, including 22-year-old Sandy Irvin. This time, they would attempt to summit in pairs so that if something went horribly wrong, they wouldn't lose, the entire group, all of their climbers at once. The first pair that made an attempt was George Mallory and Jeffrey Bruce, and they almost made it, but had to stop short because of crew illnesses. And so, 2 days later, George chose to go up with a different partner, Sandy Irvin. He chose Sandy because of Sandy's experience with supplemental oxygen. On June 8th, 1924, George and Sandy left their porters at the final camp and ascended towards the peak. A photographer tried to follow them from afar, but rolling clouds shrouded them every few minutes. And so the photographer wasn't really able to follow them super closely. However, at 12:50 p.m., the clouds cleared out for a brief moment, and George and Sandy were actually seen on a rock step at an elevation of about 28,230 feet, only about 1,000 feet away from the summit. This was the highest that anyone had ever climbed, and they were going higher and higher by the minute. And so the crew celebrated. Technically, history had already been made just by the altitude they had reached, and they believed that, even more history was going to be made that day when they reached the peak. But the clouds would end up rolling in once again, and this obscured George and Sandy. Nighttime came, and the next morning, some crew members returned to the highest camp in order to meet George and Sandy there, presumably after they had come back down from the summit. But when these crew members arrived, there was no sign of George or Sandy. The crew even put sleeping bags into a T formation, which was code to anyone watching down below from base camp that the climbers hadn't made it back. And that afternoon, the code switched to 6 blankets in the shape of a cross, which was the sign of death. I mean, it was impossible for them to have survived a night on the mountain, and so, for now, it would be their grave. Officially, the first people who summited Mount Everest were Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay in 1953. But I think that there's at least a very large possibility that George Mallory actually made it first. And so does respected historian Tom Holzall, who is fairly certain that Sandy gave George his personal supplemental oxygen so that George could go on and reach the summit on his own. Tom believes that the rope connecting Sandy to George ended up breaking, and that Sandy died due to a fall, and that George, after reaching the summit, had no way of coming back down and died near the peak. In the decades after their disappearance, pretty much every expedition was on high alert for any clues leading to their bodies, right? In 1936, a climber named Frank Smythe claimed to have seen one of their bodies using a high-powered telescope, and then in 1975, several Chinese climbers claimed to have seen 2 English deads, but not knowing the potential significance, they buried the bodies before they could actually say who they were. Or at least that's the official story. There may have been a cover-up from the Chinese government about this, but that's a story I already told in a previous video. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But if we take that at face value, that's 2 potential sightings over 75 years. And that was it. And so fast forward to 1999, when the official Mallory and Irvin research expedition was launched with the hopes to discover 2 things. First, the bodies, more likely Sandy's rather than Mallory's, because they believe that Sandy died closer to the highest camp. And second, a vest pocket Kodak camera that George used, which potentially could have evidence of whether or not he reached the summit, like a photo from the summit. This would change history. And so those were the things they were trying to find, but to be honest, the odds of finding them were not good. I mean, using the analogy of like a needle in a haystack pales in comparison. I mean, you're looking for a needle on the world's tallest mountain. Like, not good odds here. And yet, somehow, on May 1st, 1999, one of the searchers from this expedition, Conrad Anker, stumbled off the path and came across a pile of clothing and a rope. And as he kind of was, poking around investigating this clothing, he touched something that was rock solid. I think you know where I'm going with this. It was a frozen corpse, a massive, massive discovery. And at first, Conrad Anker thought that he had found the body of Sandy Irvin. However, when he looked at the jacket that was kind of, still over the body, the label read G. Mallory. He was completely shocked. That's probably the biggest understatement of this entire video. George Mallory, his body, it was right there in front of him. And of course, George's body had deteriorated, but the possessions that were found with it were very much intact. However, his pockets did not contain a camera, nor did they contain a photo of his wife, which George had stated publicly he would place at the peak of Everest if he made it. And of course, that photo was never found at the peak of Everest. The coordinates of Conrad Anker's discovery were marked, and a crew would return the following year to further examine the body. But the weird part is, and this is a little hazy, but when a team returned to the exact coordinates, George's body was gone. And my understanding is that it hasn't been seen since, which just tells me that something is going on here that may be beyond normal Everest mystery stuff. I don't know, but the last update that we got to this story was just this past year, 2024, when Sandy Irvin's boot and a part of his leg were discovered. However, the rest of Sandy's body and the entirety of George's body are still up there on the mountain waiting to be discovered by someone else, or I guess in George's case, rediscovered. And so obviously George Mallory's body may not be the most visible on our list, but this next body may come dangerously close to taking that honor. Sometimes Mount Everest produces warnings for climbers that if you choose to ignore, you are risking everything. And when our next Everester ignored her warning, it wasn't just deadly, but it literally changed Mount Everest history. Hannelore Schmatz was born in Germany in 1940. And unlike some of the other people we've talked about in this video, she didn't grow up as an elite athlete. She did enjoy hiking, of course, but dreams of reaching the world's tallest mountain were only just that, dreams. But that would all change in 1962 when Hannelore married a man named Gerard, who was a high altitude climber. And it was Gerard who introduced Hannelore to the possibility of her becoming a mountaineer too. Over the next decade, the husband and wife took on the smaller peaks of the Alps as Gerard showed Hannelore the ropes. Get it? Ropes. Okay, I'll focus. And something I want to make clear here is that Hannelore wasn't just like following her husband's lead. I mean, he was encouraging her to guide other hikers and build her own intuition, knowing that one day they might need to make decisions on their own. Between 1973 and 1978, the couple went on an absolute tear in the Himalayas, climbing higher and higher mountains with every trip. Hannelore became one of the faces of German climbing because she was setting records left and right. And so it was only fitting that in 1979, the couple took on the Himalayas' crown peak, even the world's crown peak, Mount Everest. Hannelore did most of the prep work for this expedition. Much like Marty Hoey, Hannelore was the only woman in her crew, but, with her husband by her side, she felt truly unstoppable. They made it through a giant blizzard, and once they arrived at Camp 3, the crew split into two smaller parties who would make individual summit pushes. The first team to push up was led by Gerard and didn't include Hannelore. On October 1st, 1979, Gerard and the first team reached the summit of Mount Everest and then made it back to camp before nightfall. The second team started their summit push early in the morning of October 2nd, and they were feeling confident. There was no reason to worry. They even had Gerard watching from below in case something went wrong. By this point in their expedition, this second team was very used to the sounds of heavy breathing, boots crushing into snow, and wind just whipping into their faces. But as the morning wore on, a new sound crackled through Hannelore's walkie-talkie. And this was a extremely panicked Gerard who warned them of bad weather reports and suggested that they turn around and head back down the mountain immediately. When she heard this over the walkie-talkie, Hannelore kind of paused to look around. And other than some light snow, the weather, the conditions weren't anything out of the ordinary. Like, it seemed fine. What's the deal with this warning my husband just gave me? And because of this, the second team decided to push on, thinking that Gerard was just being overprotective of his wife. And almost as if the spirit of Mount Everest was listening to that walkie-talkie, the weather conditions worsened almost immediately after they continued on. Heavy snow rolled in, and it became a grind to get to the summit. But despite these difficulties, the second team actually did make it to the summit right around 1:30 p.m. Hannelore did become the fourth woman to ever summit Mount Everest. But now, on the way back down, she had to avoid becoming the first woman to ever die on Mount Everest. The weather was getting worse by the minute, and Hannelore, as well as another climber named Ray Jeanette, were starting to succumb to exhaustion. And as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, there is no worse place for a nap than in the death zone of Mount Everest during a storm. As the sun went down, Hannelore and Ray were not well enough to descend without risking a fall. And so they laid down on the icy slope near the South Col, but that didn't mean that they were giving up. Hannelore thought that she was prepared for this kind of situation. She started making a bivouac, which is basically shelter without a tent. The Sherpas begged the two climbers to keep descending, having never seen this kind of shelter work so high on the mountain. But Hannelore and Ray stayed. One Sherpa named Sungdair decided to spend the night with the two of them, trying to do his job, trying to protect them. Folks, imagine trying to fall asleep in below freezing weather with only a third of the oxygen that you need to survive, and doing all of this without a tent. And unfortunately, Ray's hypothermia didn't allow him to do this. He struggled until sadly, he passed away before morning came. Hannelore and Sungdair somehow made it through the night, and now they had to hurry up. Sungdair developed frostbite so bad that his fingers and toes were turning black, and Hannelore was barely able to move at all. At some point during their descent, if you can even call it that at this point, Hannelore just straight up collapsed. She sat in the snow, resting on her backpack, and she begged for water. And tragically, those would be her last words. Sungdair went on without her, surviving barely, but losing most of his fingers and toes in the aftermath. And this probably goes without saying, but more than anyone, Gerard was devastated. I mean, he did everything he could have to try to get his wife up and down the mountain safely, but the warning sign that he gave her over that walkie-talkie unfortunately just wasn't enough. Ray's body was hidden quickly by snowfall, and by early 1980, it had already disappeared. But Hannelor's body did the opposite. It sat on the mountain right above Camp 4 on the southern route for years. Eyes open, face wind-etched, hair moving through the wind. This is a perfect example, as much as it pains me to say this, of, a deceased climber's body becoming a landmark. In fact, Hannelor's body landmark, feels weird saying that, you know what I mean though, was even given a nickname, which was the German woman. In 1984, a recovery effort was made by local police because, having a visible dead body sitting between Camp 4 and the summit wasn't a very good look. But in that effort, a police officer and guide both ended up falling to their deaths. And so no more recovery efforts were made, and Hannelor's body sat there for 3 more decades. It was one of the bodies that defined the infamous area of Everest known as Rainbow Valley, named after the scattered colored jackets of climbers who unfortunately didn't make it off the mountain. Many people wrote about seeing her body almost as if it was like a rite of passage. At some point around 2014, Hannelor's body was pushed over a ridge just by the elements and out of the line of sight of most climbers, but her life and her impact on hundreds of Everest climbers after death put her into legendary air. So now we're getting into the real likelihood of seeing a body on Everest, and this next story is about someone who was taking every single precaution on their climb. Someone who did stop at the first warning sign, and even then, Marko Letenaker still makes our list. Marko was born in 1959 in Slovenia, a country obsessed with mountains, but instead of traditional climbing, he went into competitive ski mountaineering, a brutal combo of high altitude climbing, cross country, and of course downhill skiing. And that sounds intense, obviously, but I want to be clear that Marko wasn't a daredevil. He worked in mountain rescue, learned basic engineering to fix gear, and was known for being cautious and precise. After placing 6th at the 2004 World Skiing Mountaineer Championship, he kind of changed things up in his life, and the following year, 2005, he joined an Everest expedition on the northern route, obsessively preparing, mastering his gear, and studying past Everest disasters like so many serious climbers do. Marko summited Mount Everest on May 21st, 2005, in as pretty much of a textbook fashion as you could possibly imagine. They had a tight weather window to get back down, but Marko's party knew about this, and so they took no pauses for glory on the summit. Marko essentially just tapped the top, took a quick photo, and then started to carefully descend. And as he did, he noticed that his mask wasn't fitting him right. There was this small hiss coming out from right under his nose, and so he adjusted on the fly. Or at least that's what he thought he did. He thought he fixed it, and he kept going, and at least for the moment, he kept breathing. But a few minutes went by, and the problem with his mask persisted. He knew he had to fix this before things got worse, and so he stopped descending for a moment to focus on the oxygen kit. But his hands were moving slowly, and each time he thought he had it and started to descend again, the hiss came back, and so he had to stop again. Marko was trying to fix the issue himself, and he didn't ask anyone for help. But maybe he should have, because in hindsight anyways, it's obvious that he most definitely needed some help in this moment. The difference between this equipment issue and any other equipment issues he had faced before was not actually in his gear, but in the setting itself. Taking even just a few short minutes to fix a mask on a normal mountain, well, that's one thing, but taking a few minutes to fix an oxygen mask in the death zone of Mount Everest is, well, a borderline death sentence. Eventually, those minutes ran out, and Marko never made it back to camp. His teammates learned the next day that he had collapsed quietly, kind of laid down in the snow, and died, primarily due to lack of oxygen. And folks, Marko actually died right below the summit on the route up to the peak, which not only meant that his body was pretty much unrecoverable that year, but also that it would be highly visible to future climbers. For over a decade, Marko's body was visible to anyone climbing the northern route of Everest. People who described seeing him said that his mask just kind of sat right off his face, like he was just about to solve the problem before he perished. Every single year, there were conversations about sending a team up to recover his body, but it was always decided that it would be too risky. That is, at least until 2017. This is when members of a private crew reached Marco's resting site with the intention of doing something about it. But when they reached Marco's body, they had to take a beat because what they saw was deeply disturbing. His face was like fully preserved, like the skin and all. It wore a pained expression, almost as if Marco had been choking on his last bit of air. And they realized that Marco's body would be just too heavy for them to move down the mountain. And so the crew covered Marco's remains with a white canvas, one designed to withstand the elements for, a long period of time. They covered him up, they performed a ritual, and then they left the mountain. Now, I haven't been showing you guys that many photos in this video just because most of them are too graphic for YouTube. I don't want to get my channel in trouble, but I will show you this photo of where, to this day, you can still find Marco's final resting place with his body covered in that white canvas just off of the northern route. Like, the fact that it's still up there is just nuts to me, but not quite as nuts as this next body, who happens to actually be an Everest legend that you won't recognize by his name or names, but rather by the nickname given to his body. I'm talking, of course, about Green Boots. If you're climbing Everest on the north side, you are almost guaranteed to see the infamous body known as Green Boots. A frozen figure lying against the slope, boots bright neon green, jacket stiff, and wind sculpt. And again, you've probably seen photos of Green Boots. Unfortunately, I know for a fact I cannot show those photos specifically. I will get in trouble. And so rather than focus on the photo, I'm going to tell you about the man, or possibly the men, who people think is or was Green Boots. And that probably didn't make sense. Let me explain. These two Indian men are Tasiwang Paljor and Dorje Marup. And get this, they were both friends. On May 10th, 1996, their party tried to make a summit push that I'm sure they would have all liked to take back. Now, May 10th, 1996 may sound familiar to some of you. It might hit a nerve because that's the same date of the highly reported disaster that took the lives of Rob Hall and Scott Fisher and was written about by John Krakauer in his book Into Thin Air. But all of that craziness was happening on the southern route of Everest. On the northern route, Paljor and Morup's party was just about to reach the summit when they were hit by an unexpected blizzard. Half of their party bailed immediately. They didn't want to take any chances. But Paljor and Morup and their party leader pushed on, and at 3:45 p.m., the three of them reached the summit. This was obviously a big deal for them because, it's Mount Everest. But it was also a big deal because they were Hindu. It added a spiritual importance to the accomplishment. And as a result, they spent way more time at the summit than is typically advised, placing down prayer flags and offering gifts to the mountain. But there was one massive issue that isn't super well known. It's possible that due to poor visibility, they might not have actually been on the summit at all. And this is just speculation. It's definitely not confirmed, but it is certainly possible that where they were doing this ritual was actually about 430 feet below the summit on a false peak. And if this is true, it might explain why their descent down was not so blessed. After they reported via radio that they had summited, we didn't get any more updates from their team. At around 7:30 p.m., base camp saw two headlamps moving through the darkness, and they assumed that it was Paljor and Morup. Flash forward a couple hours, an unknown amount of hours, but not that many, and the mystery of the exact identity of Green Boots was born. There were two separate sightings from two separate groups of Japanese climbers, one of Paljor alive, and one of Morup also alive. The first report was that in his Green Boots, Paljor was heading slowly down the mountain. The second report was that Morup was refusing to put his gloves back on, and after he accepted some help with his rope, he kept descending. Neither team realized that these were the missing Indian climbers they had been told about earlier, and so no one thought to, rescue them. And as a result, both of these sightings would go on to be the last times that Paul Jor and Marup were ever seen alive. While most people believe the body known as Green Boots, which, found its final resting place in a small rock cave, right off the main route. Most people believe that it belongs to Paul Jor due to the matching description of the boots. However, the body was found without any gloves in sight, and based on where the Japanese climbers claim to have come across Marup, that means it's possible that it is actually his body. And again, unlike most of the other climbers that I've talked about in this video, Green Boots' body rested directly on a well-used climbing route. And so for years, the body served as a literal trail marker. Like people would say, when you see Green Boots, you know you're getting close. And get this, there has never been a successful attempt at removing Green Boots. Even though his body has been partially covered by snowfall and rocks, to this day, Everest climbers can still see a streak of neon right off of their route to the summit. And there's two things that really get me about this story. The first is that there is definitely still a body up there that hasn't been discovered belonging to either Marup or to Paul Jor, whoever isn't actually Green Boots. And I wouldn't be surprised if that other body is actually discovered fairly soon. And so just keep that in mind when the next climbing season comes around for Everest. And the second thing is kind of emotional, to be honest. This thought just really gets me. The thought of one of these two men excitedly going shopping before this trek, the biggest trek of their lives, and thinking, like we all do, something along the lines of, should I buy, the fun, colorful pair of boots? He didn't choose plain boots. He wanted a pair that stood out. He wanted to feel cool and awesome climbing Mount Everest, just like George Mallory did. And that's the reason why I think Green Boots is a perfect but totally depressing symbol for Mount Everest. In one moment, it can feel cool, awesome, even conquerable, but one day of bad weather, or one piece of advice not taken, or one malfunctioning mask, or one unclipped harness, or one torn rope, and just like that, Everest turns into your tomb. Folks, please show some love for all the victims I talked about in this video in the comments right now. And remember that though they have become known as Everest bodies, each of them had a full life and definitely had loved ones who wish they would have come home instead of becoming famous landmarks. So just keep that in mind when you're commenting. And YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this one next, and so give it a click. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.